Is that a yes? Yes, good. Okay, hi. My name is Mary Keogh. I'm a PhD graduate here from the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, and I'm really glad to be here today. I'm reminding myself immediately to speak slow because, as my captioner told me last year, I speak 300 words a minute. So that's really not helpful for anybody who's trying to caption or interpret. So if I start to speed up, I won't be speaking that long, you'll be glad to hear. But if I do start to speak up, just holler. So I'm really glad to be here to chair this panel today with the wonderful speakers that we have. We have 3 here, and we will have one person attempting to Skype in. I heard yesterday there was a difficulty, so hopefully he will be joining us by Skype later. So our session for the next 100 minutes is discussing intersectionality, and it's connecting psychosocial disability and other identities and the implications of this. And our first speaker, which is sitting to my right here, is Dr. Bhargavi Davar, who is coming to us from India, who is a renowned academic, who is someone who has personal individual experience of the issues, and who has established the Bapu Trust in India, which I know from my colleagues is a wonderful organization in terms of the work you do. So Bhargavi is going to speak first on the intersection of psychosocial disability and gender. So Bhargavi. Thank you, Bhargavi.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a heavy morning. I was really touched by all the sharing this morning. Thank you all so very much. I'll try to link up my presentation with some of the issues that came up in the morning. I'd also like to thank people who spoke with feedback and comments from the day before. It kind of really helped me to see where I want to pitch my presentation. For sure, I'm confused because I love to talk to students, and I believe that there are lots of students here. And I learn a lot from talking to people with great expertise who I know are also in this room. So there is a quarrel in my mind. What is the exact balance that I need to bring into my presentation? And I'm just going to do the best I can. My intervention has 3 parts to it. The first one is about where do you find intersectionality in the CRPD? What is intersectionality? A second part to my presentation is a case study from India. It's a legal case study, but it could be a program case study or a policy case study. We seem to be getting it wrong, all the time. We know the CRPD, we know it exists, we know the provisions, we've read the text several times, we've read the concluding observations, we hear about this, we go to trainings, but we get it wrong. I think that's the key message from this morning, country after country, trying to implement the CRPD and getting it wrong every time. So how is that? How is that happening again and again? What's coming in our way? So that's the second bit. The third bit is how to get into the CRPD. How do you get into it and also get it right? So this is the broad scope of what I have to say. I begin with a kind of working definition of intersectionality. To me, intersectionality refers to the status of people within development. In the afternoon at lunch, some of us were discussing the sessions so far. We didn't very often hear the word development. We know that the CRPD is a social paradigm, but we're not hearing social development as much as we would like to. We're hearing a lot about the medical paradigm. and what to do with it. But we are not talking a lot about how to get into the social paradigm, how to get into the development sector within our country's situation. So intersectionality refers to the status of people within development. Their quality of life and standard of living is factorized by several structural parameters, including age, class, gender, caste, race, sexuality, disability, urban, rural, and so on. Those structural elements intersect with each other, compounding the experience of inclusion. When these factors negatively impact, the outcomes experienced by people would include marginalization, discrimination, exclusion, enhancing the risk for violence, abuse, and exploitation. And for sure, as we heard again and again, in case of persons with mental health issues or psychosocial disabilities, the risk is very high for institutionalization and coercive treatment. For those of us who have not heard the concept of intersectionality very often, I have an example of the differences of life experiences, of social experiences, of being a woman, being a rich woman or a poor woman, being a young woman, a girl child, or an older woman. Different levels of social experiences and life experiences would come into the picture depending on what is the status that they occupy. If you were a poor woman and you add an additional dimension of being a young adult, a poor woman who is a young adult, and then you add further layers and further layers. Poor woman, young adult, living within an institution with intellectual disability, or a poor woman, young adult, living in an urban slum, living with a physical disability. Poor woman, young adult, living in the community where there is lots of local services available. A rich woman living in a rural area, in a farm, having very little access, and she has a physical disability, and she has no access to any of the surrounding areas despite having all that wealth. So this is intersectionality. You've got, and you can add, things like sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual preferences, as a facilitator or as a barrier. Then you could add age, the experiences of children with disabilities, and so on. So when we talk about intersectionality, it's really, that is the broad frame within which all of us live our lives. And it impacts all of us. So we can locate ourselves on a spectrum of structural factors, which then impacts our experience of disability. Now, CRPD and intersectionality. Where is intersectionality in this CRPD? For any question relating to these concepts like, inclusion, where do you find inclusion in the CRPD? Where do you find legal capacity in the CRPD? Where do you find discrimination in the CRPD? Where do you find equality in the CRPD? A really safe answer to this question is you find it everywhere. If you don't know all the different small provisions and the big provisions of the CRPD, and if you were asked this question, where do you find these things? Where do you find women? Where do you find gender? Where do you find children? Where do you find, all of this? You just say it's found everywhere. So I've got this number of these concepts here on equal basis with others. There are lots of references to multiple discrimination. Very specific references in many of the articles on gender-based aspects, age-appropriate, specific articles on children with disabilities and women with disabilities. That does not exclude the fact that nearly through the text, you have references to age-appropriate provisions and provisions based on gender aspects. So it's there, it's coming up everywhere. As a specific article, this is just to give an example of what kind of provisions are found. For example, Article 8, there is a smaller provision which says that to combat stereotypes, Article 8 is on awareness, to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices relating to persons with disabilities, including those based on sex and age in all areas of life. If no specific mention is there of, say, gender, age, sexuality, and so on and so forth, this one term found in Article 5, on equal basis with others, runs in every article of the text of the CRPD and can be used as a really very potent kind of analytical concept to understand intersectionality. And of course, if you touch the general principles, it's really a flooding of thoughts and practices and suggestions on intersectionality and how to mobilize that in understanding all human experience of disabilities and beyond. So I'm not going to read this segment. I think you may have been provided with the CRPD text. So this is the first part of my presentation. Second one is, how do we get into the CRPD? This is a visual of a recent Human Rights Watch report, which is the title of which is Treated Worse Than Animals. It's abuses against women and girls with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities in the institutions in India. This is really the tip of the iceberg, because there have been any number of reports, Supreme Court and other kinds of reporting, judgments, directives, all of that, policies. We have many of those things over the years, but these things continue to happen. And this one is a very hard-hitting report which came out a couple of years ago. And like the others have said, this is happening against the background of the CRPD. So how do we go through the CRPD and come out of it with better sets of actions that will actually result in the full enjoyment of all rights for persons with disabilities? How do we actually, what kind of actions do we need to take? Not just knowing or being informed about the CRPD, but what's happening? What is confounding the outcomes in a way that all of us know it's wrong, but yet it continues to happen worldwide? So I think this is really, for me, a really curious situation. I want to share a case study here, very much inspired by the CRPD. It was taken up by a very big, high-profile human rights network in India. There is the example of an institution called Asha Kiran, where children with disabilities were interned, and it's a very old organization. There was a litigation, it was a long, enduring kind of litigation, public interest, called Reena Banerjee versus the government of NCT of Delhi and others, and details of the case law is given here. Deaths, violence, abuse, and various human rights violations over the years have been reported from here since very long. And a high-profile human rights organization and their networks in close collaboration with organizations working with children with disabilities were involved in this particular public health, public interest litigation, said to be CRPD compliant, inspired by the CRPD, working towards an outcome of full enjoyment of all rights. Now, recently we got to see the final judgment from the Supreme Court. It has many redeeming features. Those features are about making reforms from within the institution. Even though we have a Rights of Persons with Disability Act now, which talks about right to living independently and being included in communities, the final judgment is really about reforming the institution. How do you reform this institution? However, the more concerning part is the huge segments of this particular judgment coming from the highest court of India is about bringing these institutions nationwide, and there are several dozens of them across the nation, under the Mental Health Act. So far, the concern has been that people in institutions, even though they are not mental health institutions or mental asylums, are being continuously drugged and detained with psychiatric medication, chemical restraint of people living in institutions which are not mental institutions, has been an area of big concern. So what we really expected was that this aspect of psychiatrizing people who are living in just any other institution, not a mental institution, needs to be challenged and questioned. And these people within this particular child institution setup need to be rehabilitated, brought out, and brought into communities for community living. Instead, what happened was, with this sleight of hand by the Supreme Court of India, supported by a number of very well-meaning, well-informed, high-profile lawyers, by a sleight of hand, many of these institutions are now converted into mental institutions, actually legitimizing the drugging of people in those institutions. And this is not an intended consequence. Nobody planned this, but nobody foresaw this either. People were not thinking, okay, how can we have a judgment which is CRPD compliant and favoring inclusion? I don't think this was planned for, and so this is the net outcome. So this is a very unexpected, undesirable, disappointing and saddening outcome, because we have many such institutions for children. Now they will come within the scope of the Mental Health Authority, which is working with really old colonial laws. So there is an elephant in the room, several dozens of old colonial provisions in India which delegitimize people, their autonomy, decision-making power, and their capacity to act. These are found in all laws, but most perniciously, they are found in family civil laws. So despite all good intentions, these laws come in the way, tweaking and twisting judicial outcomes away from full inclusion of people diagnosed with or perceived to be mentally ill. It is really impossible for a post-colonial state, and I think that, in the West, we heard story after story this morning, and we're all in the same situation, to change the imagination of the lawyering community with its really heavy precedents of case law on lunacy, idiocy, and unsoundness of mind. And for me, it's kind of great evidence about the impact of colonialism on legal tradition and legal practitioners in India that we had such an outcome. So coming to the final part, why do we not talk development and inclusion? When we talk about social paradigm all the time, but when it comes to mental health, we are getting into more and more nitty-gritty of taking legal instruments piece by piece and going to the court piecemeal. I think for us in the Global South, a lot of our efforts, we did a lot of this for 5, 7, 10 years. We did a lot of this. And then we found that we really have to get into those communities and start working over there. We really have to look at possibilities that development offers. We have to reclaim our communities. We have to talk to, yesterday somebody was saying that, why don't we talk to the psychiatrists? The problem is we've been talking to the psychiatrists and the lawyers all the time. Let's go out and talk to the teachers. Let's go out and talk to the nutrition people, the sports people. Let's go out and talk to all the people who are organizing these big cultural events, the rock shows, the classical concerts. Let's go and just talk to people who are generally out there. There are many kinds of expertise that we need. Let's talk to the urban planning people. Let's talk to the people who are providing social services in the urban slums. So let's do that. Let's build partnerships. Not to say that you don't talk to psychiatrists, but I think so that there is a wide world out there which we really need to tap into, because they are huge resources, and that is how we will get out. So I think it's important to ask questions differently. Is it possible that when planning litigation, human rights organizations start looking at inclusion as an outcome and process all jurisprudence and litigation strategies with this in mind? For us in the Bapu Trust and in TCI Asia, inclusion captures the essence of the outcomes that we want to see for persons with psychosocial disabilities. We need those tools, the frameworks, the theories of inclusion. There's not much. If you look for theories of inclusion in academia, it's not found. Whereas you'll find many treatises on the mental health laws and the harm that is causing. No doubt those researches need to be there. But we need to know, how do we frame the question so we actually go out there and start practicing inclusion. Inclusion is not an inherent human value. We all need to practice it. So we need those theories of inclusion to emerge from the field of academics. So we know from works worldwide that social environments create the causes and conditions for personal experiences of health and well-being, ill health and disability. And this is what the CRPD is about. It's about impairments and the interaction with social barriers. And here's a slide which tries to capture that. And we are living in the times of the CRPD and the SDGs. I think it's possible for us to go deep into the social paradigm, start with startup researches and pilots and so on to see, okay, poverty causes mental illness. And so can we create poverty eradication programs? Housing first, food first. So can we start thinking in this way and linking up with different kinds of social efforts as a standalone strategy for mitigating the field of mental health? Yeah, so I stopped with this because this is another very inspiring, inspiring document, and I hope that whenever we feel really, really oppressed, and I have felt oppressed for many years of my life, just being in a post-colonial state where they are building these private institutions everywhere. And I say, okay, let's work on no poverty, let's work on zero hunger, let's work on good health and well-being, let's work on quality education, let's talk to the gender equality people, let's talk to the public works and sanitation, go clean the rivers and plant those trees. This all will work and it will make our lives better. And I think so that's where we would like to go. Thanks a lot.
It'd be a good idea to turn on my mic. Thank you, Bhargavi, for taking us through a journey of the CRPD from an intersectionality perspective and linking it with development, which I think is very important from a human rights perspective. We will have time for questions at the end, so if it's okay with everybody, I'll be leaving questions to that time when the panelists will be able to field some questions on each presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Laura Serra. Laura is a research associate here at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy. And Laura's interests are with regard to women with disabilities, equality and non-discrimination and intersectionality. She's a vast amount of experience of working both at governmental level in Argentina. She's also worked and contributed into the recent general comment on women and girls, Article 6 with the CRPD, and has also worked with other UN working groups on discrimination against women in general. So Laura is here to speak to us today about intersectionality and psychosocial disability in older persons. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Marie. Okay, so the presentation that I have here to share with you is about intersectionality regarding older persons with psychosocial disabilities. And I have two main questions regarding this. how does intersectionality help, and how is the impact of age, psychosocial disability, and any other factor of identity how can we cover this impact? So first of all the persons with psychosocial disabilities, it's important to say that they are not a homogeneous group. They are all the persons that acquire psychosocial disability with age, or that they are persons with psychosocial disabilities who age and become older. Also, they have other identities. They could be women, they could be men, they could have different, like I said, sex, gender, they could be intersex persons, transgender persons, different social environments, they can have different sexual orientations, and so on and so on. So there are some virtual identities that they are virtual because they are not actually real, and that triggers some facts and some situations that older persons with psychosocial disabilities pass through. These virtual identities are that older persons with psychosocial disabilities are vulnerable, are weak, are docile, dependent, submissive, they have no decision making at all, they have no desires, no will, they are a burden to society and to the family, and they are objects of welfare. So these virtual identities kind of are the trigger to certain facts, like I said, or certain situations that older persons with psychosocial disability are passing through, such as institutionalization, physical, financial, and sexual abuse, psychosocial abuse, neglect, malnutrition, etc., etc. So these virtual identities, they happen because of prejudice and stereotypes and the practice of the stereotypes, that is stereotyping. I'm talking about ageism and ableism. So the body does not fulfill the standard, this standard that the law back in the days create, because this standard, I'm sure that was created. I'm talking about men, white, middle class, with a social environment that is educated and able and all that. So when the body does not fulfill the standard, oppression becomes, and oppression becomes from the state, from the law, society, and family. I'm going to come back later on this. So, sorry for the letters there. I want to, do this thing, but I'm not so good with this. The situation of older person with psychosocial disability. So they are kind of in an isolation because consent and autonomy are denied from them. This is, they don't have the right to legal capacity. So the rights that they want to achieve, this is economic and social control rights and civil and political rights, they cannot have them because they have a violation of the equality, because they are in an isolation. These examples that I have here, social security, healthcare, access to justice, the end of violence and abuse, are real demands of older persons with disabilities in general, actually. Why is this? There are a working group actually right now at the UN of older persons. There is a possibly convention in the future, and older persons with disabilities are also there, and these are some of the demands that they are indeed demanding. So this is the violation of equality. It's not a violation of equality just as a right. Also, it's a violation of equality as a principle, as a value, and also as an obligation of public authorities. Why intersectionality? So we have older persons and psychosocial disability. So, like I said before, we have the stereotyping, ageism, and ableism, and there is a confluence of different factors of oppression. Take this into account, and we can move forward. Intersectionality has kind of three phases. So the first phase is that intersectionality is a paradigm shift. I know that maybe this could be kind of nerdy, but has an end, I promise you. So, intersectionality as a paradigm shift. Why is this? paradigm cover interpretative frameworks that are used to explain social phenomena. So intersectionality is explained to us a social phenomena. In this case, with a particular social group that is older persons with psychosocial disabilities. So intersectionality is a paradigm that reminds us that oppression cannot be reduced to one fundamental type, and that oppressions work together, producing injustice or social injustice. So intersectionality seeks to capture the structure and dynamic consequence that arise from the interactions between two or more axes of subordination. I'm talking about, for example, ageism and ableism, and we can add some axes of subordination. So this is kind of the paradigm of intersectionality. Also, intersectionality is an analytical tool. It's an analytical tool, maybe this is more for researchers or for the academia world, but it's very helpful. It's a critical tool because explicitly challenges status quo and aims to transform power relations. And for that, we have some guidelines or some indicators such as inequality, relationality, power, social context, complexity, and social justice. I don't going to stop here because maybe it's kind of boring, but if you want to discuss, we can discuss. So we have to take into account that intersectionality is a paradigm shift. We can understand how oppression is organized. The thing that I'm trying to say is that oppression is not a casual thing. It's really organized. So we have different domain of power. We have the structural domain of power that organize oppression. And this structural domain of power could be, for example, the state in itself, or, for example, an institution, a psychiatric institution. The hegemonic domain of power is the biggest domain of power, is always there because justify oppression. The hegemonic domain of power is ideology. This could be religion, social culture, or whatever, but it's always there. In fact, we can have working the different domain of power, and for example, it could be the structural domain of power, but disciplinary domain of power is not there, but hegemonic domain of power is always there because it's the one that justifies oppression every time. For example, virtual identities that I say here that appear to be neutral are not neutral, are virtual because of the work of the hegemonic domain of power that justifies oppression and makes that something that is false, something that is unreal, make it real for society. The other domain of power is the interpersonal domain of power. This could be, for example, family, but family could also be here in the structural domain of power. Then we have the disciplinary domain of power that manages oppression, and this could be, for example, criminal justice, or an administrative, it's not justice, but an administrative sphere, or mental health laws, for example. So they manage the oppression. So the thing that I want to show to you is that with the paradigm shift of intersectionality that help us to understand that oppression is not just, oppression doesn't come from nowhere, it's very organized and it's very well organized. And they want to believe to us, to society, that this is neutral and this is the normal thing. If you can think in the examples, for example, persons with disability, women, and all the social groups that you want to think. Also, older persons with psychosocial disability. Also, intersectionality is an approach to non-discrimination. Historically, At international level as well as national levels, ableism and ageism were mutually excluded. We have older persons social movement, and we have people with disability social movements. But no social movement by itself has addressed the entirety of discrimination that they face. Maybe they add some identity, but they don't think the discrimination that they face in a real way, well, I'm going to go there later, but in a real intersection. I don't want to go forward, but I think that I'm going to understand later. We have, in a legal framework, we have the Inter-American Convention on Protecting the Human Rights of Older Persons that mention older persons with disability. But, well, this is a personal opinion. They don't mention in an intersectional way. They kind of add people with disabilities, and they think more in accessibility, like a physical accessibility and so on. So in the non-discrimination legislation, we have different approaches to non-discrimination. One of the approach is the one-dimensional approach of discrimination. It's the most common approach. It's still there on the legislation. Is of course in ground one only, and the grounds are treated in a parallel ways. Then we have multiple discrimination. That is a situation when a person is discriminated for two or more reasons, but separately. So we have the word multiple suggests that we have a sum of the layers of discrimination. So we have ableism, ageism, and we have, the different layers, but they are one on top of the other, or one beside the other. So keep this in mind. Then we have the intersectionality approach. So the intersectional discrimination, here the layers connect with each other. They provoke a synergy among them, which forms a single form of discrimination. So intersectional discrimination is a specific type of discrimination. So the difference between multiple is that multiple, we have all the layers, but in fact, imagine a case of law, whatever, we have all the layers of discrimination, but they're going to treat in a parallel way. They're not going to be together. Even if there is the same person, for example, even if an older person with psychosocial disability. But the intersectional discrimination, we have a unique form of discrimination because the person was discriminated because in this case is an older person with psychosocial disability. So the layers interconnect themselves and form a unique form of discrimination. So this is very important to understand. This is not a legal tool yet, but human rights treaty bodies, they were talking about this. I think the better definition is from the CEDAW committee in the General Recommendation number 28. The CRPD committee is also talking about this, but in a different way, maybe. And the CEDAW committee, of course, is regarding women, but we can apply for other identities. So what are, like I said, intersectional discrimination is not yet a legal concept. For example, in the European context, we have multiple discrimination, but we don't have intersectional discrimination. So we have some challenges in addressing intersectional discrimination. And one of the challenges, I think, is that maybe we have a misuse of the concept of non-discrimination. Equality and non-discrimination should not always be present in the so-called non-discrimination legislation, but should be a cross-cutting tool, kind of as we want that equality and non-discrimination be spread is, I don't know if is well the pronunciation, but it's spread around all the legislation, like the CRPD wants. For example, the CRPD, for the CRPD, equality and non-discrimination is not just a principle, it's also a right, and it's among all the convention. The despite that they have a special article, for example, Article 6, that talks about non-discrimination, but, well, this is a personal opinion. For me, it doesn't talk about intersectional discrimination. We can discuss this, but that's another thing. So, non-discrimination laws in general are operated in such a way that discrimination prohibits harmful treatment or treatment that has a detrimental impact by belonging to a particular group. The problem is that sometimes we belong to more than one social group, because we have multiple identities. It's very weird that a person has just one identity. Even we can't jump to identity and identity. And for example, the best example for this is age. Most of us, the young person here in the room, well, I hope nobody has an accident or something, but we're going to be older. And so it's an identity that for sure, except a tragedy, we're going to have. So we cannot ignore that at some point in life, we're going to be older. So the thing that I want to show is that identities are not always fixed to the person. And we can go inside the identity and then we can go out. Disability is the best example. Transgender is another example. We can have a lot of examples that identity are not fixed. Other challenge is that I think there's a vague conceptualization between multiple and intersectional discrimination, even in documents that are legally binding. I think this is very important to achieve and have a clear concept about what is multiple discrimination and what is intersectional discrimination. Also, there is a lack of disaggregated data on disability and on older persons. I think data, I know Dan doesn't like data, but I think it's crucial because we can know what we are talking about, and for intersectionality, that we have multiple identities is crucial have data in this case. What does intersectionality provide? Provide empowerment. Why is this? By reconstruction the dialogue, empowerment can arise because reconstructions bring emancipation. And emancipation, of course, brings empowerment, especially self-empowerment. It challenges the order of established power relationships and that are governed by the domain of power that I talked recently. Sorry. The domain of power that I talk about, structural power, hegemonic domain of power, and so on. What does intersectionality also provide? Provide equality. With intersectionality, we're able to see the real situation, in this case, of older person with psychosocial disability of another social group. We can achieve substantive equality. This is equality of opportunity. Substantive equality is perfect because we can measure equality. So we can achieve equality of opportunity, but that is not enough. We have to measure equality, so we need equality of results. So with the results, we can measure the equality, and then we can achieve substantive equality. Also, we can achieve equality as a transformation, and this is very important. If we can identify oppression, if we can identify how oppression is organized, we can restructure society. For me, the problem of equality is very structural. We can have all the special measures that we want, but if we cannot solve structural inequality, we are not going to solve the problem. So, achieving equality as a transformation give this to us. Why is this? Because we, of course, restructure society, we can have a redistribution of power and resources, we can change the institutional structures which perpetuate oppression, the domain of power that I were talking about. Also, intersectionality embrace diversity, and this is crucial. Because if we realize that we have multiple identities, we can embrace diversity, because diversity is going to be visible for all of us, for society and for the different domains of power. So, if we can embrace diversity, we're going to increase investment for older persons with psychosocial disabilities in public policies, in legislations, and so on. Also, this is very important, if we can embrace diversity, we can join forces with the social movements. It's not that now that we know intersectionality, one social movement regarding, for example, older person has to study the other identities, so become more, so they can improve their social organization. No, I'm talking about that the different social movements can work together to improve society, but taking into account what intersectionality means. For example, with amicus, there is an interesting paper of Susan Friedman, I think it is, I'm not sure, that talks about amicus of identity, of cross identities. So if the social movements can help each other, but taking into account intersectionality, is going to be huge, the impact that is going to create to society. So yesterday I was in the break sessions and someone says, how can we, create networks and improve our social movements? Okay, if we're gonna start intersectionality, not very kind of, I'm sorry, Maria, not very kind of nerdy, but I think this is very important. What I was saying, but in a way that, if we can understand intersectionality and if we can understand that the person, we have different, multiple identities, we're going to join forces with the social movements and improve ourselves as a society. I'm sorry. I think the Convention on the Rights of Older Persons is a perfect opportunity. Potentially it's going to be a Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, I hope. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to introduce the concept of intersectionality, but not just as a non-approach, as a discrimination approach, but also as a paradigm and also as a research tool. So I think it's the best opportunity to do a kind of mainstream and a cross-cutting concept of discrimination with intersectionality. And thank you for your attention now. Yes, okay.
Thank you, Laura, for a very passionate talk on intersectionality. As a former PhD student who had that as her paradigm, it's not something easy to explain in 20 minutes. So I really give you credit for your presentation. Okay, so our next speaker is Matilda González from Colombia. Matilda is here to speak to us today about the intersection of psychosocial disability and trans issues. And she's a lawyer with the Universidad, my Spanish is not so good, Matilda, de Los Andes in Colombia. She's worked there as a legal fellow. Can I ask for just silence? Because for the interpreters and the captioners, when people are speaking, you need to have silence, if that's okay. It's the one rule I'll set. Matilda has worked as a legal fellow for 1 year with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. She's a renowned, I suppose, media person as well, in terms of giving a TED talk and having weekly columns in two newspapers. I'm guessing in Colombia the names, I don't know the newspapers, but I'm presuming they're newspapers. And yeah, Matilda, we'll hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, hi. How are you? No, I'm like in a very, like I'm outside of my comfort zone because I usually go and talk to people about being trans, and because people don't know what trans is, so you can make mistakes and people like wouldn't realize it. But because I'm talking about disability and most of you are like experts on disability, so I feel more nervous. But like I wanted to have this conversation or to imagine that like trans and disability are going like in a date and they are going to meet each other and they found out that they have more things in common than they knew. But we still don't know what's the nature of our relationship. Like, so like the trans movement, like we have this intuition that we like the disability movement because we think it has some useful concepts like reasonable accommodations, universal design, and different things that are very useful to talk, for example, about restrooms, bathrooms, about the reasonable accommodations at universities to change your name, etc. So somehow I ask you out for a date and I'm trying to convince you to stay with me. And I wanted also to have this talk because like I was in Bogota, where I live, and I was in Grindr. Grindr is like this application where you look for sex or relationships or dates. And then like when the guy came to my house, like I didn't knew he had a disability and he had like this, like a prosthesis arm. And then he was very scared of like taking his shirt off and there was like this feeling that we have so much more in common because trans people have the same feeling when we go dating. Like we don't know if we should say before, or if someone asks you out in a bar, you don't know if you have to say before you kiss him or after you kiss him. So I felt that it was like this sort, like we have so much more in common. Like should we tell, should we not tell? But also the motivation of that, like information, or if we should say it or not, was about how our bodies are different, or how we should hide something about our bodies because the world is afraid of them. And that also is linked to how, like this sense of monstrosity that is so often in the trans movement, like a lot of trans activists also talk about this feeling of feeling monstrous, or like monsters, or less like monstrosity. So the map of the presentation is about like defining what is the nature of our relationship, because we could say like as you were saying before, intersections is like when we realize that people are oppressed by more than one intersection. So we could say that we are dating or that we are friends. But if we go at the other extreme and we said that trans is a disability, we would be talking not about different types of oppression that affects one person, but we would be saying that being trans could be also a form of disability, and therefore we are not even talking about intersection, but we are rather talking about another type of disability. So the idea of my talk today is not to have a conclusion. It's again like, let's imagine that we are meeting, we're dating, we're sharing information, we still don't know the nature of our relationship, but the idea is to give like different ideas and questions to have that solution or that conclusion afterwards. We don't need to decide that now, we don't need to rush into marriage or anything. So the first part is to talk about if the CRPD applies to trans persons. Then there's like the spectrum, like there's the easy argument, like you could say that the nature of the intersection between trans and disability is just anecdotal, like trans people get more depressed, when trans people get hormones, like they get more depressed, like the rates of anxiety and depression, like the trauma trans people get for violence or for attacks. Like there's an intersection with mental health, and that's like the anecdotal type of intersection. There's something in the middle that it's not so easy argument, and it's about pathologization, which which I will explain later, and it's the process of trans persons when you try to go to the health system and they tell you that you first need to go to a psychiatrist. That would be like in the middle. And the difficult argument, like marriage, like the difficult question, would be why is transness not a disability? So that's like the spectrum. Like the intersection is just anecdotal. The intersection does exist, but only as perceived as I will explain later. Or is disability, or is transgender also a disability? So those are like the spectrum or the three options. So this talk started because the trans movement, like we are always, or not always, but we are politically, we are in an identity crisis, because we realized that the LGBT movement did not represent our priorities. Like the LGBT agenda is always talking about marriage, family, kids, adoption, etc., but we are not really in the agenda. LGBT organizations, they don't really have trans representatives, not in the organizations, but not in the boards of the organizations. So there's a political difficulty there. Also, when we try to go to the women's movement, even though things are getting better, still we need to argue first why we are women. So there's another identity crisis. And in this, where should we go? Where are we? Why not try to study the CRPD? And we started to find out, historically, our link was much more closer than what we thought. So there are some similarities and intuitions. Mainly, there's this discussion about sterilizations without consent, the medical normalization of the body, violence in institutionalization, and discrimination and mental health. So what happened with forced or sterilizations without consent is that we can see it in two ways. Usually when trans people go to the doctor, you need to go and say that you want all the surgeries, that you want sex reassignment surgery in order to the doctor to believe you that you're trans and in order to them to treat you. So somehow you don't get the whole information and you know you need to go and lie to the doctor in order to get what you want. So there's a problem of informed consent because you don't have the whole information and you enter the field of psychiatrists and doctors, etc., from a place of fear. And also for kids, because being trans is considered a sickness that is cured by surgeries or hormones or whatever. So if you go without any information or without any political background to get medical information, they would recommend you to get all the surgeries. And that is also, that may also be considered a sterilization without consent, without informed consent, because you didn't get the whole options. In other countries, in order to change the sex in the ID documents, you are required or to get surgery or to have a medical proof or something. Sweden has this initiative to give reparations to those trans persons that were obliged to do forced sterilizations or surgery in order to change their ID documents because it was a requirement in order to access a right, which is ID documents. So there's we have that in common. We also have a lot of discussions about forced sterilizations without consent, etc. There's also this medical normalization of the body, which you get pressure from everywhere. You get the pressure from your community. So if you get surgery, it means you are kind of betraying someone. But if you go to the doctor, he will tell you that you need to get surgery, and at the same time you don't know yourself what's your decision. So there's also this idea that's always in your mind when you're taking the decision to take hormones or surgery. If you should, what's the normal body of a woman or what's the normal body of a man. So that's always in tension also there. Our bodies are not normal, how we make them normal so the society feels more comfortable, but also how do we feel more comfortable without the pressure of our communities, but also from the medical field. We also have, we have received a lot of cases in which trans persons, but I will explain this later, let's have the violence there for a second, and I will explain it in the next slide. The second part is about pathologization. Pathologization, as the word says, is to consider trans identities as a pathology, or as an illness, or as a sickness. And the question is if pathologization is a form of imputed disability, and therefore if we could use the CRPD in the category perceived as disability in order to protect trans rights. So what is trans pathologization? So trans pathologization is first considering trans identities a mental disorder, but we also call trans pathologization the process in which the pathologization, or the idea that you need to get a psychiatric certificate from a doctor, it's considered also a requirement to access any of your rights. In this case, like health-related, any type of hormone surgery, etc. So you go to the doctor and they say, like, no, you need to go to the psychiatrist. And what we have also seen is that a lot of times the psychiatrist required people to have like a 2-year exam and consultation in which they make like very weird questions. Like they ask you if you like football, if you like Barbies, if you like, it's true, like, and it's an actual test. And some of the cases that I have seen is that they have more than 2 or 3 gender dysphoria certificates, which is like, it is not only to go to a psychiatrist and to have these ridiculous questions, but you go over and over and over again. And now, why that process could be a form of imputed disability, or a form of perceived as disability, because the process of labeling trans identities as a mental disorder, or the motivation to call it as such, is because trans people do not conform to like gender stereotypes or roles in society. So, if you are born with a penis, like you could be a normal guy, or you could be a man with a mental disorder that wants to be a woman, but never a woman. Like, that doesn't make part of the explanation or of the response. The motivation behind the label of the mental disorder is a gender stereotype, which is all women have or are born with vulvas, right? Which also tell us that there's something about how we perceive body and functions, and there's a question if we should talk about this, about bodily difference or not. Like, that's one of the questions. So, the Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel and Degraded Treatment, like, they have been, like the concept of forced psychiatry that is used for persons with disabilities. We have tried to push that concept legally to use it in trans cases, because even though the Special Rapporteur always uses it in the context of people with psychosocial disabilities or disabilities in general, like, we also think that if you cannot access your rights because someone is forcing you to go to a psychiatrist, like, we should talk about it as forced psychiatry, and therefore it could be considered torture or other cruel or degraded treatment. The committee has also talked about perceived impairments, referring to Article 15 in a concluding observation to China. It said, for those involuntarily committed persons with actual or perceived intellectual and psychosocial impairments, the committee is concerned that the correctional therapy offered at psychiatric institutions represents inhuman and degraded treatments, etc., etc. So there is a movement called Stop Transpathologization, and the main objective is to get the category of gender dysphoria, like, outside of the APA diagnosis, and in the World Health Organization, they don't want to take it out, but they want to change gender dysphoria from the chapter of like sickness or illness or whatever, and to put it in the chapter of only definitions. So in that way, like legally, lawyers and activists can use it as a source, like it's in the World Health Organization, but it's not an illness. So that's always there. Which brings us also to the difficult question of coverage. Like if we take out pathologization, how can we make sure that all trans persons can access hormones and surgeries through the public health system? Like there are examples of laws that replace the idea of pathologization with informed consent, but not in every country. We can pass laws, and usually the legal strategy is to sue or to go through judges, etc. So part of the strategy is to keep it in the World Health Organization like book, but in a different chapter. And now this is like the difficult question. This part, like, I'm not sure. I have read several things. I don't have a position yet, or like I'm not ready to defend it yet. But I think it's really important. Like, the question is really important. Like, why is trans not a disability? So, in the United States, the American Disabilities Act in 1990 said, disability should not include, like, even though transvestism, transsexualism, etc., gender identity disorders were included in as psychosocial diagnosis before, in 1990 somehow they said disability should not include being trans into those diagnoses. Why? One of the senators in those moments expressed concern that employers would not be able to exercise their moral standards in making judgments about hiring of certain types of employees. That's one interpretation, is that they took us out because it was very difficult to defend politically, but also because conservatives didn't want the enterprises or the companies to be afraid, or like they will have to hire trans people. A second interpretation is that the sponsors were being extra careful, and that when they excluded trans from the ADA, it was not because they had bad intentions, but because they knew judges could introduce it after through litigation. And this year, the Federal District Court in Pennsylvania said the ADA applied to trans persons, and the case was, there was a company called Cabela's Retail, and Blood, which was a trans woman, she entered the company and she said hi, I'm trans. And and then she said okay, I need you to issue me some uniforms, some name tags, and I need to use the bathroom. And their answer was no uniforms, no name tags, and if you want to go to the bathroom, you can go across the street and enter to the Dunkin' Donuts restroom. It was literally the answer. Then Blood refused, they sued the company, and then the federal district said that the ADA applied to trans persons for two reasons. First, they say being trans is not itself a medical condition, but if the person feels distress for being trans, that is a medical condition. And that's where all the tensions come together. So the first part is the trans movement is constantly saying we are not sick, being trans is not an illness, saying that a person that is born with a penis is a guy and not a woman. It's actually sexism and transphobia, etc. But the problem with this case exactly is that it's saying the opposite. It's saying yes, being trans is kind of a sickness or kind of a disorder, because if you feel discomfort with your body, it means you're kind of sick. So there's this tension of using the American with Disabilities Act, or in general the disability legal framework, in the pathologization debate. But I think a very interesting question is to ask ourselves if when the trans movement said that saying that being trans is a psychosocial disability is pathologizing, it's bad, does it is it true, or does it mean that the trans movement actually is being ableist? Because it's a very ableist argument. Why are we so afraid of being labeled as disability? Probably because we think disability is something bad, or disability is a sickness, and we don't want that label. So one important question is to find in the answers of the arguments of why trans is not a disability, if the arguments are ableist or not. Because I think there's something there that we need to pay attention. Okay, and the second argument is that the definition of the disability in the CRPD is divided in two. So the first part is impairment, and the second part is disability. So impairment being a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, and disability being like the social construct of the disability definition. Somehow it's like the definition between biology and social construct. And I think the trans movement has an issue with that. One of the arguments of the trans movement is that sex is assigned at birth, that people are not born women, that people are not born male or female, but rather that people are born with certain bodies, with certain genitalia, but then the sex is assigned at birth to them after an interpretation that people make of the body. And that was, like, the argument is called gender trouble, and it's the difference between sex and gender. So the argument is, through many, many years, feminism, or some feminisms have talked about sex as a biological truth and gender as a social construct. Like, you are born male or female, but then gender is where we have a discussion about gender, about stereotypes, about whatever. The trans movement has said no, like, the sex is also a social construct. Like, you are not born male or female, but the sex is assigned at birth. So what happens when we have that framework and that argument, like when we bring those ideas to the definition of disability? Because there's this also like this division. Like, impairment is part of this like biological truth that we cannot touch. It's like this diagnosis that the doctors or biology, or like something that is just as it is, like you are born with an impairment or not. But then disability, yes, that part is a social, yes, sorry. But disability is, okay, the social construct. So I think it's really interesting to use the same framework, first to problematize this idea of biology and culture. The second part is why, if we problematize the idea that body parts are not essentially functional, like if we problematize penis and vulvas because they are like in the middle of our legs, like why shouldn't we problematize other parts of the body or other functions or whatever? And there's also this argument of the geography of the body. And like there's a critique from the trans movement to the disability studies, because they said that usually like they have talked about functionality in genitals, for example, but when people have not done transitioning. So for example, the second point, if you have hormone deficiencies, or yes, if you have hormone deficiencies is a good example. If you are not trans, it's seen as a disability because you don't have a hormone deficiency. Like, you have a hormone deficiency, therefore it's a disability. But if you are trans, like, it's from the trans study field. Like, let's not talk about it in disability terms. There's also an example of the prosthetic penises versus sex toys. So if a man that is like a not trans person doesn't have a penis, we talk about it as disability and we talk about prosthetic penises. But if we talk about trans guys, we talk about sex toys and not as a disability. So it's also an important question. Like, it's not a conclusion again, but it's also like an interesting way of looking at things. The last part is, yes. So they talk, and this is the last slide, is that, so like there's this idea that, okay, you're trans and you are in the non-pathologization field, and you say like being trans is not a pathology, being trans is not a mental illness, being trans is not a psychosocial disability, like, okay, fine. And the question is, like this author that is Alexander Baril says like, okay, but there are some people that say that even with surgery, even if transphobia disappears in the world, they still feel this sort of discomfort with the body. And that's where I'm lost. Like, so, as a conclusion, because time is over, like I wanted to bring these like more questions than answers, because I'm not really like ready to defend a position. But I do think that if we see it as we are dating, we are meeting, like just see if we have more things in common, and probably the conclusion is that we need more time dating before we take like a final conclusion.
Thank you, Matilda, for such a thought-provoking presentation and so many questions, which I hope we can take up during our question time period. So now I think by the wonders of technology, we hope we will have Henri Nichols joining us from the Fundamental Rights Agency in Austria, who's going to be talking about the intersection of psychosocial disability and refugees. We might see if we can connect him.
I need to switch this over. 1 second, Henri.
Henri's bio is in your pack. He's a wealth of experience around non-discrimination and equality, particularly in terms of research around the impact of counter-terrorism on Muslim and Irish communities in Britain, which I think is, in its current climate that we're in, is quite interesting research. So I hope we can connect them.
Hello, Vienna.
Hello, Vienna.
Hello, Galway.
Okay, we're going to try and keep you on the video here for the minute, but we may just switch to audio, okay? So,
yeah, and if it's possible, maybe to turn the computer towards the crowd. And is the PowerPoint presentation, is it on the screen?
Oh, did we get his PowerPoint in the end?
I don't know whether.
I don't know that we did, Henri.
Oh, it doesn't matter. It's okay. It's not essential.
Okay, cool.
You can share it afterwards if you like with the participants.
Yeah, it will go out to everybody else.
Yeah, it's not essential.
Okay. I'm going to try and give you a view of the chair there. Let me.
Or the crowd, rather.
Oh, the crowd.
Yeah.
Crowd. Okay.
Yeah, if it's possible. Oh, now I can see you.
Okay, let's just come out here. We're all good.
Henri, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm just chairing the session. We have Maria here, who's timekeeper. I don't know, Maria, what way you'd like to flag the time virtually. And I just wanted to point out as well, we have captioners and interpreters as well. So just to say, just to let you know that.
No, I won't be more than 15 minutes, I promise.
Okay, thank you, Henri.
Okay. You should have enough time for the coffee.
We'll hand over to you then, Henri.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting Fra to give a presentation on this panel. Sorry we could not be there in person, but from Vienna to Galway, it's a bit of an adventure, which unfortunately we couldn't do this time, but we are very happy to be able to give you this input in this form. And can you hear me clearly? Just nod your head if you can, and then I'll know. Okay, fine. So this presentation will be a bit different from the ones that have been so far. And if I'm speaking too fast for the velotypist, give me a sign as well. Is the speed fine to speak? Okay. So just very quickly, for those of you who don't know, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, we are an independent body of the European Union, and our role is to give evidence and advice to the European institutions and the member states when implementing EU law. And the area of disability is one of the areas of work, and we have a large project on the right to independent living of persons with disabilities. The information I will provide you today is drawn from a study, a monthly report on the situation of migration in selected member states. And in August 2016, we had a special report on the situation in 7 member states, namely Austria, Bulgaria, Germany, France, Greece, Hungary, and Sweden. So my presentation will be in 2 parts. On the one hand, I will give you a bit of the legal framework underlying the issue of migrants and disabilities. And the second part will be some of the evidence that we gathered from this report on the situation of migrants with disabilities in these 7 countries. So the first thing to note is that persons with disabilities comprise a significant minority of refugees and migrants. And in addition to pre-existing physical, sensory, intellectual, or psychosocial impairments they may have, people can also acquire or develop impairments during the migration process. When identified, these impairments place an obligation on member states to provide specific support throughout the arrival, registration, and asylum process. But there is, however, little information available on the situation of migrants and refugees with disabilities that recently arrived in the EU, which mainly results in anecdotal evidence and individual reports of particular challenges faced. Concerning the relevant legal framework, the CRPD itself does not explicitly make reference to refugees and migrants with disabilities. However, Article 11 of the Convention on Situations of Risk and Humanitarian Emergencies does require state parties to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict and humanitarian emergencies. Other relevant articles of the CRPD in that respect include Article 5, which prohibits discrimination on the grounds of disability, Article 9, which requires that both the physical environment and information and communications are accessible to persons with disabilities, Article 25 on health, and also Article 26 on habilitation and rehabilitation. Excuse me. In June 2016, the European Parliament had requested the European Commission and the European Council to provide for special care for persons with disabilities when making proposals for resolving the refugees issue in accordance with Article 11 of the Convention. The CRPD committee also had some recommendations to make to the EU in that respect. So it underlined its deep concern with the precarious situation of persons with disabilities in the migration crisis in the EU. Particularly, it noted that refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers with disabilities are detained in the EU in conditions that do not provide appropriate support and reasonable adjustments. The committee also noted that migration decision-making procedures are not accessible for all persons with disabilities, and information and communication are not provided in accessible formats. And the committee also recommended that the EU issues guidelines to its agencies and member states that restrictive detention of persons with disabilities in the context of migration and asylum seeking is not in line with the Convention. There is also relevant EU law, and I will mention some of the relevant provisions of EU law that you might find interesting in the context of migrants with disabilities. So we can note the Asylum Procedures Directive, which provides that certain applicants, including those with disabilities and mental disorders, may be in need of special guarantees, and that these applicants should be provided with adequate support. In addition, there is the Return Directive, which highlights that country third nationals, that the physical state or mental capacity of a third country national can be a potential reason for postponing removal, and that special needs of vulnerable persons are taken into account during the period for voluntary departure or when removal has been postponed. Another directive that is relevant is the Reception Conditions Directive. I will say a bit more about this one. This directive requires that member states assess whether an applicant is an applicant with... Yep.
Sorry, just to disturb you, sorry, it's just Mary the Chair. Could you slow down just a small bit if possible?
Yes, of course,
Thank you so much, thank you.
Yeah. So the Receptions Directive requires that member states assess whether an applicant is an applicant with special reception needs, and that the assessment is initiated within a reasonable period of time after an application for international protection is made. The support provided to such applicants should take into account their special reception needs throughout the duration of the asylum procedure. However, this directive has not yet been transposed into the national law in all EU member states. The Reception Conditions Directive also requires that material reception conditions provide an adequate standard of living for all applicants, which protects their physical and mental health. This includes ensuring that such standard of living is met in the specific situation of vulnerable persons. The category vulnerable persons is what is used in the directive also to refer to persons with disabilities, so it's their own wording, just to specify that. And the Reception Conditions Directive and the Asylum Procedures Directive both require that asylum applicants shall be informed of their rights in a language which they understand or are reasonably supposed to understand. The Asylum Procedure Directives further includes a provision for interpretation. because having information available in an accessible form is essential for ensuring that individuals are able to access the rights and support to which they are entitled. However, from the research we conducted, there was little evidence of accessible information, for example, in easy read format for persons with intellectual disabilities in any of the 7 member states. And there is also the psychological strain associated with migration, which makes responses to mental health problems particularly important. EU legal provisions make specific reference to the importance of providing necessary mental health support. The Reception Conditions Directive highlights the primary concern to be given to mental health of vulnerable persons in detention and requires that member states provide necessary medical or other assistance to applicants with special reception needs, including appropriate mental health care where needed. In the interest of time, I will skip the evidence we have on evidence of torture, but I can provide you with the written presentation as well, so you can have more information on that if you like. So, in relation to the main findings then of this research in the 7 countries, there are a number of things that we can note. Overall, there is a lack of formal procedures to identify migrants and refugees with disabilities, although some tools to support identification are available. But the lack of the formal procedures can have a significant knock-on effect for the provision of targeted and support and assistance. Identification is actually most likely to take place during health screenings, but the high number of arrivals and limited resources have, however, reduced the opportunities for timely identification. In some cases, individuals can wait for up to a year before health screening is made in some areas. Identification of persons with disabilities often relies on other information provided by the individuals themselves or on the presence of a visible disability. Impairments that are not immediately noticeable often remain undetected until later interviews or medical examinations or even later in time. We also found out that some individuals do not disclose their disabilities to the police, social services, or to migration authorities for fear of affecting their asylum application. So the identification of and support for persons with disabilities relies heavily on the expertise and knowledge of the individual staff, but there is a lack of relevant training for those staff. This can impede the identification of impairments, particularly impairments that are less immediately visible, and of course the provision of appropriate support. It is also important to note that there are no systematic data available on the numbers of persons with disabilities among arrivals, nor is there any breakdown usually of the type of disability or impairment that they may face. Anecdotal evidence suggests that mental health issues, and notably post-traumatic stress disorder, are particularly relevant, tied both to traumas experienced in the country of origin or on the journey to the country of asylum. For women in particular, mental health issues are often linked to experiences of gender-based or sexual violence. It goes without saying that identification as a person with a disability is crucial for accessing specialized support, and I think I need to slow down again. All of the 7 member states have specific arrangements in place for people with disabilities in reception and detention centers. These include specific accommodation arrangements, steps to make facilities more accessible, and the provision of assistance devices such as wheelchairs and hearing aids. Some form of psychosocial support and treatment is available in reception and detention centers in all of the 7 member states where we went. And this support is often provided by NGOs. But their limited capacity means, however, that there are often long waiting times for support and a lack of adequate interpretation services. So people find themselves in a situation where they do not necessarily get the help that they need. So this is a very broad and fast overview of the situation of migrants with disabilities, but maybe the main point that we can draw from this situation is that and that might be of interest to you also, it's an under-researched area of work. There is little evidence available, it's mostly anecdotal evidence, and there is little to no systematic data collection and data analysis in that area. So I would finish with these words that it's an area that needs more attention, and maybe some of you would be interested in picking that up. And I will leave it at that for now, and I hope it was clear and that I wasn't speaking too fast. Thank you.
Henri, can I ask, are you okay with us to stay for some questions and answers?
Yes, that's fine, yes.
Great, okay. Just before we open, because there's been lots of input, and I think everybody probably there's some burning questions, I'm sure. Just one announcement. Professor Amita Danda, I think is in the front here, is going to announce the winner of the poster competition at the end of this session. Yes? Okay, so we'll do that before we finish up. And I just want to check with Maria, our timekeeper. We have 5 minutes for questions? Oh my God. I know, oh God, there's lots of